My name is Ed Wilcox, and I'm the Watershed Research Extension Associate at Kentucky State University. And my role at the university is to provide information about water use, land use, and water quality. And that's to anybody wherever they may be living. And for this presentation, I'm going to talk about stormwater, non-point source pollution, and bourbon spills, how they fit into land use and water quality, but also how any of this information isn't unique to the Kentucky River watershed. So I've just mentioned a word, watershed, that maybe you're not familiar with. So let's take a look at this slide here to kind of help you understand what a watershed is. So if you look at this slide and you see the yellowish area, that's the Kentucky River watershed. And a watershed is just a common drainage area. And all that really means is if it were to rain and that water were to get collected, because it doesn't soak into the ground, if all that water were to get collected and directed to a waterway, it would all drain to the same place. And in this image, that would be in the upper left corner in a town called Carrollton, Kentucky on the Ohio River. So, and sometimes you'll see watersheds also called drainage basins or just basin, as you can see from the title on this. So, to show you how smaller watersheds can make up much larger watersheds, we'll kind of start with where Kentucky State University is located. It would be inside this red ellipse on the slide here, and it's straddling a creek. You can see a creek that's going through the center of this ellipse, and that creek is called Yateman's Branch. And that creek flows down to the Kentucky River. So Kentucky State University is in the Yateman's Branch watershed. But because the Yateman's Branch flows into the Kentucky River, it's also part of the Kentucky River watershed. And then the Kentucky River, as I mentioned previously, flows down into the Ohio River. So it's part of the Ohio River watershed. And that's on the left side of this slide, the yellowish area again. In the Ohio River, it flows into the Mississippi River, and that's on the right side of this slide. That's the Mississippi watershed. So you can see from this slide and this example that smaller watersheds make up much bigger watersheds. And also you can see that wherever you may be, there's always someone who's going to be downstream from you. So whatever may be happening in your watershed, someone farther downstream is also going to be affected by that. And so, as I mentioned, I like to talk in terms of water quality as it relates to land use, and so that's what we're going to do here. I'm going to show you a demonstration using a model. It's called an Enviroscape, and we're going to see how land use affects water quality. So now we have a model of a watershed, and it's a very simple model. There is some infrastructure in here. We have some roads and a parking lot and some bridges, but otherwise we still have what makes up a watershed. We have some terrain and drainage areas that go down to a common drainage area. But since we have this infrastructure, let's put some vehicles on the roads, because roads are for driving and cars drive on the roads. So now that we have these vehicles on there, we can presume too that they aren't just going to be out driving for the sake of driving. They go to and from places, right? And so let's go ahead and keep building up this model, and we'll put some residences into our model. So we have some homes that go in here, and we have to take down some natural area to put these homes in here. Maybe someone replanted this tree and moved it over to here. But so now we have homes, increased activity in this model and in this watershed. So we already had some impervious surfaces here, Now we have some additional impervious surfaces, the addition of the roofs. And we also have people who maybe like to take care of their yards or gardens, so they're going to be using fertilizers. And they may have pets, and of course pets will end up defecating or pooping, so we can have more inputs here. So that's going to be some manure. And maybe they, aside from fertilizers, they like to have their plants grow well, so they're going to apply some pesticides. So all this is some extra stuff that ends up into our environment. And then these houses, they're serviced by utilities. So let's go ahead and put a utility over here. And this can be like an electric company, but it could also be a manufacturer or some kind of industry that manufactures the stuff that these people drive around and go to buy. But let's also put a sewage treatment plant right here, because when people flush the toilet, it's got to go somewhere. And for many people, they may be hooked up to city water, and that's going to end up going down to a sewage treatment plant. Okay, and then all these people that live and work in these areas, they need things to eat. So let's put in a farm over here, because that's where we get our food. And this particular farm, it's going to grow some crops, but it's also going to raise some livestock. And so we have some cows in this case, but of course maybe they're raising chickens or hogs, or could be that they're raising alpacas even. But so now this farm, they also have a tractor to help them move things around and to get their work done. And some of this, or all of this actually, can end up over in this location as well. So it'll still be in both locations. We have fertilizer, manure, and pesticides. Well, let's put the manure over here near the cows. But, and as you can see too, there's some management practices that may be detrimental to the environment here too. We have where they've put their field all the way up to the edge of the water, and so they're losing part of their soil into the waterway. Right? And now we also have these houses must be made of something. Let's presume they're made of wood, and so we need a natural resource extraction site. And so we'll put that up in here. So we have some mining operation. And once those materials get extracted, they have to get moved to where they can be sold and used. And then we'll also presume that underneath this, there's going to be some coal, because a lot of the nation, and especially Kentucky, still gets a lot of its power from burning coal. So the material, once it gets pulled out, it's going to get transported either by truck or train or boat or barge. Some way it's going to get moved around. So now we have all this activity, and all this activity is going to be generating pollution. Again, we mentioned that there's fertilizers and insecticides or pesticides that can be in residences and in farmscapes. Just the cars themselves, they are going to be leaking auto fluids on the roadways and in the parking lots and such. And there's all kinds of fluids in vehicles. There's de-icing wiper fluids, gasoline, transmission fluid, motor oil, all kinds of fluids that can get leaked out onto roadways. And then of course, as people drive to and from their destinations, maybe they're going to be discarding litter out their window. Most people have seen litter on the sides of the road. And then aside from in the roadways, you'll see those oil or fluid stains in the parking lots. And the litter can be in the parking lots as well. So all of these things, we are now seeing this activity and its impact, all the pollution that it generates. And I didn't say this earlier, but let's go ahead and talk about what pollution is. And pollution is something that's in a space where it doesn't belong, and it's harmful to that space. So for example, if these two cars were to wreck, and then all of a sudden the fuel tank starts leaking gasoline across the road, the gasoline becomes a pollutant because it's in a space where it doesn't belong, and it's harmful to that space. It's going to kill the plant and animal life that lives in that area. And sometimes we think in terms of pollutants being strictly manufactured, but there are instances where nature can be a pollutant as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit farther down in the presentation. And now that we've seen how land use affects water quality, let's talk about the different types or sources of pollution. There's two different types. One is point source pollution and the other is non-point source pollution. And point source pollution is pollution that comes from a single identifiable source, usually a drainage pipe or a discharge pipe. And this slide shows some examples of those. Point source pollution, it's usually associated with industries or municipalities, utilities of some kind. All of their discharges are considered point source pollution. All of them together are also considered point source pollution. And then the other source of pollution is what's called non-point source pollution. And that is usually stormwater runoff from everywhere besides the point sources of pollution. Although there are also some pollutants that get contributed to waterways through atmospheric deposition. So for example, inorganic mercury, ash or dust or even acid rain, those just fall out of the atmosphere and land on the land or in our waterways. So, but otherwise, non-point source pollution mainly focuses on stormwater contributions of pollution. And so for example, those could be litter that's been dumped into a parking lot or on the side of a road, fluids that leak out of automobiles on roadways or in driveways, fertilizers and pesticides that may be residual from a farm operation. All of those things can get washed into waterways due to stormwater. And to understand why the stormwater does this, let's take a look at this graphic here. And in the upper left corner, we can see that it's demonstrating, say, if there were natural cover. That means that there's zero impervious surfaces, and sometimes they're called impermeable surfaces, but those are surfaces that when the water falls, stormwater falls, it will get caught and collected because it cannot go through that surface. So some examples of those surfaces would be roofs or roads or driveways. All of those things can catch and collect water, and oftentimes that water then gets directed to a waterway. So in the upper left corner, the natural ground cover, there's 80 to 100% infiltration, and that means the water soaks down into the ground. 80 to 100% infiltration, and maybe 0 to 20% runoff. That's water that wasn't able to soak into the ground and it just runs right off. And not mentioned on here, there's some water that will end up evaporating back into the air. But that's relatively insignificant. So presuming that a natural area then goes through some developmental succession, say maybe a farm gets put down there, we have a little bit more impervious surface. So we now have a roof and maybe a road that can collect that water. So now our infiltration has reduced to 70 to 90%, and now we have 10 to 30% runoff. So that's just an increase in the amount of runoff now. And then if we go to the lower left corner, now we maybe have that farm get converted into a neighborhood. So now there's even more houses and more impervious surface. We can presume that, well, according to the slide, it's like 30 to 60% infiltration, but now 40 to 70% runoff. So we have a dramatic increase in the amount of stormwater that runs off the land. And then in the lower right corner, this is presuming there's commercial or industrial growth and operations, but it could just be an urban setting as well. And now we have 75 to 100% impervious surfaces. So that means 0 to 30% of the water can now soak into the ground, and now it's about 80 to 100%, or 0 to 20% for infiltration, I'm sorry, and 80 to 100% runoff. So that's a dramatic increase in the amount of water that gets collected and directed into waterways. And natural areas weren't developed to receive that much water. So because of that, we can end up with flooding. And this is just a picture of some of the flooding that can occur. And this is a relatively low flood for this area. But other areas, they may experience more dramatic flooding. It all depends on the area. But this is a result of excess stormwater coming into an area, a more developed area where the stormwater runs off rather than being allowed to infiltrate to the ground. So we can see from this, this graphic, as we go through the development succession, more and more stormwater can be produced and more stormwater can be run off and collected. And with that increased runoff, because we've mentioned earlier that we have all this land use and this pollution creation, all of that pollution, or the majority of that pollution, has the potential of being collected by that stormwater and also taken to a waterway. So bearing that in mind, if we want to then compare pollution from point sources and non-point sources, which do you think might be the greater source of pollution? Before we talk about which one might be the greater source of the pollution, let's kind of do some historical context, because this will help you understand why things are the way they are. So in 1948, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act was enacted by Congress, and this wasn't even the first water pollution control legislation. There were many before this, but this one seems to be a turning point. And it wasn't until a lot of environmental concern in the late 60s, where a lot of people began being concerned with water quality. So then in 1972, the Environmental Protection Agency, which was formed in 1970, the Clean Water Act came about. It was really just an amendment to the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, but it became popularly known as the Clean Water Act at this point. And you can see there were some additional amendments through time here in 1977 and then in 1987. But these are some sequences that we get to see that there's been some environmental legislation and regulation to talk about this sort of thing. And the Clean Water Act, it was focused on addressing point source pollution issues, because the objective of the Clean Water Act was to allow for the protection of aquatic habitat and for recreational purposes. That water should be used for recreational purposes across the whole nation, and that mission was supposed to be achieved by the end of the 1980s. And sometimes people hear this being called that the Clean Water Act was to make the nation's waters fishable and swimmable. And to do it, the Clean Water Act focused on point sources of pollution, because at the time that was considered the greater source of pollution. As it turns out, the Clean Water Act failed in its mission because non-point source pollution is the greater source of pollution. Again, non-point source pollution aided by stormwater runoff, it contributes the greater portion of pollution to waterways. And state and federal regulations try to address best management practices to take advantage of improving stormwater pollution and non-point source pollution. And some examples of those may be in requiring stormwater retention ponds to be included at construction sites, and then there's silt fences that maybe you'll see at construction sites. But then there's also wetland protection regulations and environmental remediation funds. All these are regulations and best management practices that have been put in place to address non-point source pollution. So thinking of this and maybe many other things that I haven't mentioned but maybe you're aware of, what do you think might be the most common pollutant in our waterways? And we know it's not wastewater from manufacturers or industry because they're part of the point source pollution problem. And remember that that's a small contributor to the water pollution issue. Do you think maybe it might be fertilizers applied to gardens or crops, or even pesticides, or auto fluids, or litter? Well, as it turns out, there are two very common pollutants in the nation's waters, not just Kentucky. One is fecal coliform bacteria, and fecal coliforms are a type of bacteria found in the digestive tract of warm-blooded animals, and they're deposited in the environment when that when that animal defecates or when they poop. And people are warm-blooded animals also, so the poop from people also can contribute fecal coliforms to a waterway. And while fecal coliforms are part of the digestive process of warm-blooded animals, if people were to consume fecal matter or somehow ingest pathogens, they don't belong in our upper digestive tract, so we would get very sick from that. And we could end up with a sickness called gastroenteritis, and some people can even die from gastroenteritis. So it's certainly nothing that we're really interested in having. And the image that you can see here, this is of Escherichia coliform, or E. coli, you may have heard it called. But if ever you've heard of E. coli poisoning, it's someone got sick because they consumed fecal coliforms, the Escherichia coliform type. So certainly this is why we aren't interested in having fecal coliforms in the water. It can make us sick. But bear in mind, too, that the greater source of fecal coliforms is not humans, because even though humans can contribute fecal coliforms to waterways through straight pipes or aging septic systems that may be failing, or even combined and sanitary sewers, which may have overflows built into them, and those overflows can allow for untreated or raw sewage to be just discharged straight into a waterway, and it's designed to do that so that way it doesn't back up into people's homes. That's a potential source of human contributions to fecal coliforms, but it's more likely that you're going to see fecal coliforms from animals, from livestock operations. And this is an example of a cattle operation, but there's also hogs and chickens and sheep and goats and plenty of other livestock operations where you can have these massive accumulations of animal waste. And once it rains, that waste may end up getting run off into a stream or other waterway. So, and normally fecal coliforms, they'll perish once they are out of a digestive tract because they prefer living in the digestive tract. But some of them can be persistent survivors, and they can still live in a waterway. And usually once they even get into a waterway, they'll perish because they get exposed to UV radiation from the sun. However, the other major contributor to pollution is soil, and the soil can make the water cloudy and shield those bacteria from the ultraviolet radiation. So in this picture, if you're thinking that the water is brown because of fecal contamination, it's actually because it's from the soil that's been washed into the waterway. So remember, we have flooding because of lots of stormwater that now gets washed into a waterway, and when that flooding occurs, there's a lot of energy in that water, and that water can start stripping away stream and river banks, and it can cause bank collapse, and that's what this image is here. It's showing a section a relatively small section of the riverbank that's collapsed. And this is one tiny section. This is happening all along America's waterways, not just in the Kentucky River watershed. And this is another image showing some bank collapse. And this is just one part of this area. If you see that dock that's farther down there, across from the dock, there's another huge section of riverbank that's collapsed. And so while the soil can shield those fecal coliforms from the ultraviolet radiation and prevent them from perishing by that mean, that's not the main reason why soil is considered a pollutant in the waterways. The main reason is because soil carries nutrients. Nutrients would be in the form of nitrates and nitrites and phosphates. And those are from nitrogen and phosphorus. And the nutrients, they're just easily taken up by plants, and they go into a growth frenzy, or it's called a bloom. So if ever you've heard of algal blooms, that's what can happen. And that doesn't sound bad though, right? Lots of plants growing, that sounds like a good thing. But what actually happens is once you have all those algae that are blooming and growing, eventually they're going to die. And there's other bacteria that live in the water that decompose that organic matter. And they're they're aerobic bacteria. They live in the presence of oxygen, and they breathe as they decompose the organic matter. And because there's a lot of organic matter for them to decompose, they will reproduce and feed and reproduce and feed until there's so many of them that while they breathe, they will consume all the oxygen in the water. And that means that the other organisms that live in the water, fish, for example, but there's also aquatic insects, all those other organisms will end up perishing because they have no oxygen to breathe. They'll die of hypoxia, which is the lack of oxygen. So this is a quick little graphic of what that process is called. That process is the boom and bust cycle that this action is describing. It's called eutrophication. So again, you have a massive influx of nutrients. So from the slide here, it's indicating like fertilizers leak into the water, but it can be soil as well. And that causes the algae to bloom, and eventually the algae die, and then the organisms suffocate. They have no oxygen to breathe. And these areas where the eutrophication occurs, they're sometimes called dead zones. And maybe you've heard of dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico along Louisiana or Florida, or up in Lake Erie or even Chesapeake Bay. In some places, like in the Gulf of Mexico, these used to be seasonal occurrences where they'd only be around for part of the year. But anymore, there's so many nutrients that keep getting dumped into these areas that now they're no longer seasonal. The only seasonal thing about them is how big they are. So when you have massive contributions of nutrients, they tend to be very big dead zones. And these are not just out there phenomenon. Dead zones and eutrophication occur in our state. They occur in Kentucky. It's not just an out there thing. And all of this sounds kind of doom and gloom, doesn't it? I mean, we're kind of led to believe that the Clean Water Act hasn't kept the nation's waters fishable and swimmable, and stormwater brings non-point source pollution into waterways, and there's fecal coliforms in their water, and then soil, which maybe we thought was this great part of the United States agricultural story, is turning out to be a villain. But the good news is all this doom and gloom is in the presentation. If we were to look at water quality metrics, if we were to measure the water quality, we'd find that there are plenty of waterways in the United States, not just in Kentucky, that are meeting their fishable and swimmable standards, or their designated uses. And I say most of the time because what we've been talking about, these impacts that we've heard about, they're caused by stormwater. And stormwater isn't isn't around all the time. It happens when it rains. And so like the day of a rain and maybe a couple of days afterwards, maybe even longer than that, depending on how much water has to go through a system, that's when the waters will not be swimmable because you have the massive influx of fecal coliforms that can make people sick. So you wouldn't want to engage in full contact recreation, and that's just a fancy way of saying swimming, where your head will be fully submerged. You wouldn't want to engage in that kind of an activity during a rain or a couple days after the rain. And then also you wouldn't necessarily want to engage in what's called secondary contact recreation, where you may be boating or fishing, or where you can come into incidental contact where that water can get splashed into your eyes, nose, ears, or mouth. And you wouldn't necessarily want to stick your hands or anything that's come into contact with that water in any of those orifices as well. And then also if you have open wounds or a compromised immune system, you'd probably want to stay away from the water during a rain or shortly after the rain. So that leaves bourbon spills as a topic that I haven't talked about just yet. And Kentucky is the bourbon capital of the world, and demand is increasing. More and more bourbon is getting produced to meet that demand, and along with that production, there is the potential for industrial accidents. And there's two that I'm going to talk about here today, and one happened on May 7th in 2000, and this happened at the Wild Turkey Distillery in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. That's the bottom red ellipse of this graphic. And a rick house containing thousands of barrels of bourbon caught fire, and in the process of the rick house collapsing, all that bourbon got spilled and poured down into the Kentucky River. So it was about 200,000 gallons of bourbon ended up leaking into the Kentucky River. And then the other incident occurred in July of 2019. And this happened at a Jim Beam rick house, or really it's Beam Centauri. And that's in the upper ellipse along a section of Glens Creek, which then flows into the Kentucky River. And the impact of both of these was pretty much the same. You had a massive influx of nutrients in the form of alcohol. There's a lot of sugar in that alcohol, and the bacteria that live in the river that decompose that organic matter, they started eating and reproducing and breathing an awful lot. So that created dead zones in the water, and it killed thousands of fish. Certainly some of the fish perished because they just can't live and breathe in alcohol, but the majority of the fish that died because of hypoxia. They had no oxygen to breathe. And so here's an image from an online article that talked about the spill, the Jim Beam spill. The left part of the image is the mouth of Glens Creek, where the spill entered the Kentucky River. And it looks like there's a bunch of stuff in the water, but it's really just kind of foam that's been produced. And the foam is a result of a lot of algal growth. But it's not like a bunch of dead fish are right there. Or if there are, we just can't really tell. And then the center section of this image is the rick house on fire, and it was a pretty serious event. And then the right portion of the image shows some dead fish next to one of the lock chambers in the Kentucky River. And so this is certainly a graphic where you can see that there is plenty of impact. And other impacts aside from dead fish, it affected utilities, drinking water suppliers. So for example, Frankfort Plant Board, who's the water supplier to Frankfort, they had to close their intake and wait for the alcohol plume to pass before they could reopen their intake. So that affected their ability to provide drinking water to the city of Frankfort and neighbors. So certainly all this is indications that we have a lot of land use activity, the potential for pollution to get into our waterways. And we can all do better. I mentioned that the waterways are generally in decent condition, but that doesn't mean that we can't do better. We can all do better. And there are certainly conservation behaviors that industry and government and citizenry like us, we can all engage in conservation behaviors. And of course, discussing those behaviors is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I certainly encourage you to become active in your community and investigate things that you can do and what your community can do to help waterways. Because it's not just going to help your community's water, it's going to help those people downstream and those other communities who also need clean water. So I want to thank you for viewing my presentation. I hope you found it very informative, and if you do have any questions or need any clarification regarding the information I've provided in this presentation, don't hesitate to contact me. If for some reason you're unable to see my contact information, you can also locate me in Kentucky State University's directory under Ed Wilcox. I hope that you take care, and again, thank you very much.